In the years before 1941, many leaders inside Japan's military establishment believed they understood the United States. They studied its newspapers, its movies, its politics, and its economy. What they saw convinced them of something that would shape the most consequential decision in modern Japanese history. America was powerful, but it was soft. The belief did not come from ignorance alone. Japanese officers had watched the United States struggle through the Great Depression. They saw breadlines, unemployment, labor strikes, and political division. To them, this was not the image of a nation prepared for sacrifice. It was a commercial republic obsessed with comfort. American culture, in their eyes, revolved around individualism, profit, and leisure. Japan, by contrast, had spent decades cultivating a warrior ethos rooted in discipline, hierarchy, and sacrifice to the emperor. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy were deeply influenced by the concept of Bushido, the way of the warrior. Courage, endurance, and willingness to die were elevated as supreme virtues. Many officers believed that Western societies, especially democracies, lacked this spiritual foundation. They saw Americans as materialistic and racially mixed, governed by politicians rather than guided by sacred tradition. In private discussions and military academies, future admirals and generals were taught that the American spirit would crack under sustained hardship. There were strategic reasons behind this thinking as well. Japan had studied earlier wars and drawn its own conclusions. In 1905, it had defeated Imperial Russia in the Russo-Japanese War, shocking the world. In the 1930s, Japanese forces had fought prolonged campaigns in China despite international condemnation. Western powers protested, but they did not intervene directly. To Japanese planners, this seemed to confirm a pattern. The West talked loudly but avoided costly war in Asia. The United States, meanwhile, had embraced isolationism after World War I. Congress passed neutrality acts in the 1930s to prevent involvement in foreign conflicts. Public opinion polls showed that many Americans wanted to stay out of another European war. Even as Nazi Germany expanded across Europe, large segments of the American population opposed direct intervention. Japanese intelligence officers followed these debates closely. They interpreted isolationism not as caution, but as weakness. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Combined Fleet, was one of the few senior leaders who understood America more intimately. He had studied at Harvard University and served as a naval attaché in Washington. He had seen American industrial capacity with his own eyes. Yamamoto famously warned that Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year, but after that, he could promise nothing. He knew that if the United States fully mobilized, its production would dwarf Japan's. But Yamamoto's caution was not the dominant voice. Within the Imperial General Headquarters, confidence in Japan's qualitative superiority was strong. Japan lacked oil, steel, and raw materials. American embargoes, especially the 1941 oil embargo, threatened to choke the empire's expansion. Japanese leaders believed they faced a narrowing window. If they did not strike decisively, their strategic position would weaken. The plan that emerged reflected their assumptions. A surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor would cripple American naval power in the Pacific. With that fleet neutralized, Japan could seize Southeast Asia's oil fields and resource-rich territories. By the time America recovered, Japanese defenses would be so strong and so costly to penetrate that Washington would negotiate a settlement. The underlying premise was clear. Americans would not tolerate a long, bloody campaign across the Pacific. This assumption rested on a profound misreading of American society. Japanese planners saw political division but failed to grasp the unifying power of external attack. They saw consumer culture but overlooked industrial might. They observed isolationism but ignored the historical precedent of American mobilization during total war. In war games and internal assessments, some officers raised concerns about America's economic scale. The United States possessed vast natural resources, a massive population, and the world's largest industrial base. But these advantages were often discounted. Material strength, many Japanese strategists believed, could not compensate for spiritual weakness. Racial prejudice also played a role. Certain Japanese leaders viewed Americans through a lens of cultural superiority. They believed that Asian resolve, hardened by centuries of samurai tradition, would outmatch Western soldiers who were accustomed to comfort. This belief reinforced their conviction that a sudden, crushing blow would shatter American morale. By late 1941, negotiations between Tokyo and Washington were collapsing. American demands that Japan withdraw from China were unacceptable to Japanese leaders who had already sacrificed blood and prestige in that campaign. War seemed increasingly inevitable. The remaining question was timing and method. When the strike force sailed toward Hawaii in November 1941, it carried with it more than torpedoes and bombs. It carried an assumption that America's will was brittle, that the shock of destruction would frighten voters, divide Congress, and force compromise, that a democracy, unlike an empire, could not sustain total war across an ocean. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft roared over Pearl Harbor. Battleships burned. Sailors died in the thousands. The attack was tactically brilliant, but in that moment, the central calculation, the belief in American weakness, began to unravel. Instead of hesitation, the United States declared war with near unanimous support. Political divisions vanished almost overnight. Factories converted to military production at staggering speed. Millions volunteered or were drafted. The society that Japanese planners had dismissed as soft began to transform into a wartime machine. Before 1941, Japan believed it understood America. It had measured ships and counted aircraft, studied speeches and newspapers, but it had underestimated something less visible and more decisive, the capacity of a democratic society to unite when attacked, and the industrial power that unity could unleash. The illusion of weakness would become one of the most costly misjudgments in modern military history. At dawn on December 7, 1941, the waters of Pearl Harbor were calm. American sailors were waking slowly on a quiet Sunday morning. Some were preparing for church. Others were writing letters home. Battleships sat in neat rows along Ford Island, symbols of American naval power in the Pacific. Few imagined that within minutes the harbor would become a scene of fire, smoke, and chaos. Hundreds of miles to the north, 6 Japanese aircraft carriers had launched their strike waves in darkness. The operation had been planned with precision. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto understood that Japan could not win a long war against the United States. The attack on Pearl Harbor was designed to deliver a crippling blow at the outset, to buy time. If the U.S. Pacific Fleet could be destroyed in a single surprise assault, Japan would have freedom to seize oil fields in Southeast Asia and fortify a vast defensive perimeter. At 7:48 a.m., the first wave of Japanese aircraft appeared over Oahu. Dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters descended rapidly. Within minutes, explosions tore through Battleship Row. The USS Arizona erupted in a catastrophic blast when a bomb ignited its forward ammunition magazine. More than 1,100 men were killed instantly. The USS Oklahoma capsized after multiple torpedo strikes. The harbor filled with burning fuel and debris. The attack was devastating. In less than 2 hours, 8 American battleships were damaged or sunk. Nearly 2,400 Americans were dead. Aircraft were destroyed on the ground.
From a tactical perspective, the Imperial Japanese Navy had achieved surprise and inflicted heavy losses. For a brief moment, it appeared that Japan's gamble had succeeded. Yet beneath the smoke and wreckage lay the seeds of strategic failure. The primary targets of the attack had been battleships. In 1941, battleships were still widely regarded as the core of naval power. But the war in the Pacific would be decided by aircraft carriers. By chance, the Urs, Lexington, and Saratoga were not in Pearl Harbor that morning. They were at sea. Japan had missed the most critical assets. Even more consequential was what Japan did not destroy on land. The massive fuel storage facilities at Pearl Harbor remained intact. Repair yards and dry docks were largely untouched. These installations would allow the United States to salvage and repair damaged ships at remarkable speed. Several of the battleships sunk in the harbor would later be raised, repaired, and returned to combat. Japanese commanders faced a decision after the second wave of attacks. Some officers urged a third strike to target infrastructure and fuel depots, but concerns about American air defenses and the unknown location of U.S. carriers led Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo to withdraw. The strike force turned back toward Japan, having achieved its assigned objectives, but not the deeper destruction that might have prolonged American recovery. Meanwhile, events in Washington unfolded rapidly. News of the attack spread across the United States. Radio broadcasts interrupted regular programming. Shock turned to anger. On December 8th, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress, calling December 7th a date which will live in infamy. The declaration of war against Japan passed with only one dissenting vote. Japanese planners had believed that a sudden, crushing blow would demoralize the American public and force negotiation. Instead, the attack unified a divided nation. Isolationist sentiment collapsed almost overnight. Recruitment offices filled. Factories accelerated conversion to wartime production. Political differences that had seemed so deep in the 1930s became secondary to a common purpose. The strategic imbalance soon became clear. The United States possessed immense industrial capacity. Within months, shipyards were producing vessels at unprecedented speed. Aircraft production soared. What had been damaged at Pearl Harbor was replaced and then multiplied. Japan had struck a powerful opponent, but it had also ensured that this opponent would mobilize fully and relentlessly. Admiral Yamamoto had warned of this possibility. He understood that Japan's initial advantage would be temporary. The attack at Pearl Harbor provided tactical success, surprise, destruction, momentum, but it also eliminated any remaining chance of diplomatic compromise. It guaranteed a total war against a nation with superior resources. In the weeks that followed, Japan advanced rapidly across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. The Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies fell under Japanese control. For a time, it seemed that the empire's strategy was working, but beneath those victories, the larger reality remained unchanged. The United States had not been knocked out. It had been awakened. Pearl Harbor demonstrated Japan's operational skill and daring. It also revealed a critical miscalculation. Military planners had measured ships and guns, but they had underestimated the political and industrial consequences of attacking a democracy. Instead of securing peace on favorable terms, the strike ensured a long war of attrition, a type of conflict Japan was ill-equipped to sustain. The harbor still burns in memory. Twisted steel, oil-slicked water, rising smoke against a Hawaiian sky. For Japan, December 7th was a tactical triumph. For the United States, it was a shock that forged unity. In strategic terms, the attack did not eliminate American power. It unleashed it.
When news of Pearl Harbor reached the American mainland, the shock was immediate. But what followed was not paralysis. It was motion, massive, coordinated industrial motion. Within days, the United States began transforming from a peacetime economy into the largest war production machine the world had ever seen. Before 1941, America already possessed enormous industrial capacity. Its factories produced automobiles, refrigerators, radios, and farm equipment in staggering numbers. But now, those same assembly lines would be repurposed for war. President Franklin Roosevelt called for unprecedented production goals, tens of thousands of aircraft, tanks, and ships. Many foreign observers, including Japanese planners, considered such targets unrealistic. They were wrong. In early 1942, automobile factories in Detroit stopped producing civilian cars. The Ford Motor Company, General Motors, and Chrysler converted their plants to military output. At Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan, workers would eventually assemble one B-24 Liberator bomber every hour. The scale was almost unimaginable. Thousands of workers moved in carefully timed coordination, turning raw aluminum and steel into long-range bombers destined for Europe and the Pacific. Shipyards along the east and west coasts expanded at breathtaking speed. The Liberty ship became a symbol of American industrial efficiency. Designed for simplicity and mass production, these cargo vessels could be built in weeks instead of months. In 1943, the Robert E. Peary was completed in just over 4 days, a record that stunned even American officials. By the war's end, more than 2,700 Liberty ships had been launched, ensuring that troops, fuel, and supplies could cross oceans continuously. Aircraft production surged just as dramatically. In 1940, the United States produced fewer than 3,000 military aircraft. By 1944, that number had risen to nearly 100,000 in a single year. Factories ran around the clock. Lights glowed through the night in cities that had once slept in darkness. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, symbolized by the figure of Rosie the Riveter. They welded, riveted, and assembled engines, filling roles once closed to them. The numbers told a story that Japan had not fully grasped. The United States possessed vast reserves of oil, iron ore, coal, and agricultural output. It did not need to conquer distant territories for resources. It already had them. American oil production alone dwarfed Japan's total access to fuel. While Japanese ships and aircraft struggled with shortages, American forces operated with a steady, growing supply. The industrial surge extended beyond weapons. It included training, logistics, and transportation. Railroads moved troops from coast to coast with precision. New bases rose in remote deserts and forests. Universities contributed research in radar, medicine, and engineering. Private corporations collaborated with the federal government through agencies like the War Production Board, which coordinated materials and prioritized contracts. In Tokyo, intelligence reports began to reveal the scale of American mobilization. Initial Japanese victories in 1942, sweeping across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, had created confidence, but as months passed, American losses were replaced with alarming speed. Carriers sunk at Coral Sea and Midway were soon supplemented by new Essex-class carriers entering service. Destroyers, submarines, and transport ships flowed from American yards in waves. Japan's own industrial base, by contrast, was limited. Its economy lacked the raw materials and manufacturing depth of the United States. Factories were vulnerable to bombing. Skilled labor and fuel were finite. Each ship lost at Midway represented years of training and irreplaceable experience. Each aircraft carrier destroyed could not be easily rebuilt. Meanwhile, America was producing faster than Japan could destroy. By 1943, the imbalance had become undeniable. American submarines began strangling Japanese shipping lanes, sinking merchant vessels that carried oil and supplies from Southeast Asia.
Without sufficient escorts or replacement ships, Japan's logistics network weakened. Fuel shortages reduced pilot training hours. Aircraft quality declined. The gap widened with each passing month. The war in the Pacific had become a contest of endurance and output. Japan had hoped for a quick, decisive struggle. Instead, it faced a prolonged industrial confrontation. The United States was not merely fighting, it was multiplying its strength. Factories that once built household appliances now delivered tanks rolling off assembly lines. Steel mills operated without pause. Workers endured long shifts, rationing and sacrifice. War bonds were sold across towns and cities, financing the expansion. It was not only a military mobilization, but a societal one. For Japanese strategists who believed America lacked resolve, the reality was stark. The industrial tsunami was not a metaphor. It was visible in tonnage launched, aircraft delivered, and troops deployed. By the time American forces began major offensives across the Pacific, they did so with overwhelming logistical backing. Pearl Harbor had been a blow, but the response that followed reshaped the balance of power. The United States had awakened its war machine, and once in motion, it proved unstoppable.
By 1942, the war in the Pacific was no longer defined only by ships and factories. It had become a psychological struggle, a contest of morale, endurance, and the ability to adapt under extreme pressure. Japan had entered the conflict believing its spiritual strength and warrior code would outlast any material advantage the United States possessed. What followed would challenge that belief at every level. The Imperial Japanese military was built upon the ideals of Bushido, loyalty, honor, and absolute obedience. Soldiers were taught that surrender was disgraceful. Death in service to the emperor was the highest form of devotion. Training was harsh. Discipline was strict. Officers believed that this mindset created fighters who would endure what Western troops could not. Early battles seemed to confirm this confidence. Japanese forces advanced rapidly across the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. At Bataan and Corregidor, American and Filipino troops were overwhelmed after months of resistance. The fall of Singapore shocked the British Empire. Japanese commanders interpreted these victories as proof of moral superiority. They saw courage and offensive spirit triumphing over larger, wealthier powers. But war in the Pacific would test endurance in new ways. The turning point began on Guadalcanal in August 1942. U.S. Marines landed to seize an unfinished Japanese airfield. What followed was 6 months of brutal jungle combat. Heat, malaria, hunger, and exhaustion became constant enemies. Japanese troops launched repeated nighttime assaults, often shouting and charging into American defensive lines. The fighting was close, chaotic, and merciless. For the first time, Japanese soldiers faced an enemy that did not collapse under pressure. American forces adapted quickly. They improved jungle tactics, coordinated artillery with air support, and reinforced positions methodically. Supply chains, though strained, held. When Japanese troops ran short of food and ammunition, American forces were resupplied by sea and air. The psychological balance began to shift. Japanese planners had expected Americans to fear night attacks and relentless aggression. Instead, American forces learned to anticipate and counter them. Defensive perimeters were strengthened. Flares illuminated the jungle. Machine gun positions were carefully arranged. The banzai charge, once terrifying, became increasingly costly. Adaptation extended beyond tactics. The U.S. Navy adjusted after early losses. Radar technology improved detection of incoming aircraft. Carrier task forces refined coordination between fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes.
After the shock of Pearl Harbor, American commanders studied every engagement, identified mistakes, and corrected them rapidly. Learning became a weapon. Midway, in June 1942, had already dealt a heavy blow to Japan's carrier fleet. 4 frontline carriers were lost, along with experienced pilots who could not be easily replaced. Japanese training programs were rigorous but slow. The United States, by contrast, expanded pilot training dramatically. By 1944, new American aviators entered combat with improved aircraft and superior logistical support. Morale within Japan began to strain under mounting losses. While early victories had been celebrated, news of defeats was tightly controlled. Families often learned little about the fate of sons and husbands. Meanwhile, American propaganda emphasized resilience and retribution. War bond rallies, newsreels, and radio broadcasts reinforced a shared narrative. This was a fight that had to be won completely. The island-hopping strategy further demonstrated American adaptation. Rather than assault every Japanese-held position, U.S. forces bypassed heavily fortified islands, isolating them. Strongholds were cut off from supply and left to wither. This approach conserved resources and reduced casualties. It was a calculated, methodical advance that contrasted sharply with Japan's earlier expectation of decisive, all-out engagements. As the war intensified, ruthlessness increased on both sides. The Pacific theater became notorious for its brutality. Cultural misunderstandings and racial hatred deepened the conflict. Prisoners were rarely taken in many engagements. Japanese soldiers, bound by doctrine and fear of shame, often fought to the death. American troops, hardened by months of combat and reports of atrocities, responded with their own harsh resolve. Battles such as Saipan and Iwo Jima revealed the widening psychological gap. Even when defeat was certain, Japanese defenders resisted fiercely. Civilian suicides on Saipan shocked American observers and demonstrated the depth of indoctrination. Yet these acts did not break American will. Instead, they reinforced determination to end the war decisively. By 1944 and 1945, the imbalance in morale and material strength was undeniable. American forces operated with overwhelming air superiority and steady reinforcements. Japanese pilots, sometimes with minimal training, launched desperate missions, including kamikaze attacks. These suicide strikes inflicted damage, but also revealed the severity of Japan's strategic predicament. The psychological war had unfolded differently than Japan anticipated. America did not shatter under early defeats. It adapted, learned, and intensified its efforts. Industrial strength supported morale, and morale fueled further production and training. What Japan had seen as softness proved to be flexibility. What it dismissed as individualism became initiative and innovation on the battlefield. In the end, the Pacific War was not won by spirit alone or by industry alone, but by the interaction of both. Japan's unwavering code produced extraordinary bravery, yet it struggled to adjust when circumstances changed. The United States, driven by anger and sustained by resources, evolved continuously. The psychological contest that began with assumptions about weakness ended with a stark realization: resilience can take many forms. In the jungles and on the islands of the Pacific, the side that adapted faster gained the advantage and never surrendered it. By mid-1944, the momentum in the Pacific had shifted beyond dispute. What had begun as a bold expansion of empire was becoming a desperate defense of survival. For Japan's leadership, the realization did not arrive in a single moment. It came gradually, through reports of lost carriers, shrinking fuel reserves, and islands falling one by one. The point of no return was not marked by one battle, but by the accumulation of irreversible facts. The shock had started earlier at Midway in June 1942. 4 frontline Japanese aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were destroyed in a matter of hours. With them went hundreds of highly trained pilots and crew. These were not easily replaced. Carrier warfare depended not only on ships, but on experience and coordination built over years. Japan could build new hulls slowly. It could not rebuild veteran air groups at the same speed. Yet even after Midway, Japanese forces fought on with determination. In 1943, they withdrew from Guadalcanal, but continued to contest Allied advances across the Pacific. The strategy shifted from expansion to attrition. Defensive perimeters were reinforced, garrisons prepared to hold islands at all costs, hoping to inflict such heavy casualties that the United States would reconsider its advance. But by 1944, reality tightened its grip. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June delivered another devastating blow. American pilots flying improved aircraft like the F-6F Hellcat decimated Japanese air formations in what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Hundreds of Japanese planes were shot down. Carrier air power, once the pride of the Imperial Navy, was shattered. The consequences extended beyond the battlefield. The Mariana Islands provided the United States with airfields within range of the Japanese home islands. Soon, B-29 Superfortress bombers began long-range missions against industrial targets. For the first time, Japan itself was directly vulnerable to sustained strategic bombing. Meanwhile, American submarines executed a relentless campaign against Japanese merchant shipping. Oil tankers and cargo vessels were sunk in increasing numbers. By late 1944, fuel shortages crippled naval operations. Ships remained in port for lack of oil. Pilot training hours were drastically reduced. The industrial base, already smaller than America's, struggled under blockade and bombardment. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 became one of the largest naval engagements in history and effectively destroyed Japan's ability to conduct major fleet operations. In a complex series of clashes, Japanese forces attempted to repel the American invasion of the Philippines. They displayed tactical bravery, even surprising elements of the U.S. fleet, but the outcome was catastrophic. Multiple carriers and battleships were lost. Organized naval resistance was broken. In desperation, Japan turned increasingly to kamikaze tactics. Pilots deliberately crashed explosive-laden aircraft into American ships. These attacks inflicted damage and casualties, but they also reflected strategic exhaustion. The willingness to sacrifice aircraft and pilots underscored the imbalance in resources. Each American ship damaged could often be repaired or replaced. Each Japanese aircraft lost further weakened an already strained force. On land, the battles grew even more brutal. Iwo Jima and Okinawa demonstrated the cost of approaching Japan's doorstep. Japanese defenders constructed intricate tunnel systems and fought with fierce resolve. Casualties on both sides were immense. American planners began to contemplate the invasion of the home islands, anticipating even greater losses. By 1945, Japanese cities faced sustained firebombing. The March 1945 raid on Tokyo killed tens of thousands in a single night. Industrial output declined sharply. Civilians endured shortages of food and materials, yet the leadership remained divided over surrender. Some hoped to negotiate terms through the Soviet Union. Others insisted on continued resistance, believing that inflicting heavy casualties might secure better conditions. The final blow came in August 1945. On August 6th, an atomic bomb destroyed Hiroshima. 3 days later, Nagasaki suffered the same fate. The scale of destruction was unprecedented. At the same time, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria, crushing the Kwantung Army in days. The prospect of fighting on two fronts, with cities devastated and no realistic hope of reversing the tide, forced a reckoning. Emperor Hirohito intervened, urging acceptance of the Allied terms outlined in the Potsdam Declaration. On August 15, 1945, his voice was broadcast to the nation, announcing surrender. For many Japanese citizens, it was the first time they had heard him speak. The war that had begun with confidence in swift victory ended in acknowledgement of overwhelming force. The realization had been gradual but undeniable. Japan had underestimated the industrial capacity, adaptability, and endurance of the United States. Early victories could not compensate for long-term imbalance. Each lost carrier, each sunken tanker, each bombed factory narrowed the path forward until none remained. The point of no return was not simply military defeat. It was the moment that leaders understood that no combination of courage or sacrifice could overcome the scale of American power once fully mobilized. The illusion of weakness had given way to a hard truth. The war they had hoped to limit had become a total conflict they could not win.